Yeah, awesome. All right, welcome everyone. We may have a few more people come along as the session progresses, but we're here today to talk about generative AI and assessment. Particularly leading into semester, what are some of the things we can do now about designing questions, communication, and support for our students? And this is part of Ready to Teach Week, so hopefully it will help you get ready to teach. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country on which we're meeting today, and the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and the custodianships of the lands on which we meet, and we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. So we have 5 steps that we're trying to work through today. They're all fairly interesting and deep, and hopefully will be valuable for everyone. So we're going to talk a bit about why it's important. How do we make our assessment better? Cognitive ordering, values of inquiry, and ethical and effective use of generative AI. I think we may have even changed the order of this as we go to make it make a little bit more sense. But it'll be an interesting afternoon, I can promise you that much. So what I'd like to do is to start with some polling and ask how you're feeling about where generative AI is at. It feels like this keeps changing on an incredibly frequent basis. So I'm going to launch a poll and ask which of these fictional artificial intelligences you feel is most accurate as we're heading into semester 2. We have Hell 9000, Marvin from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Data from Star Trek, Holly from Red Dwarf, and the T-800 Terminator.
I like that someone immediately went into Holly from Red Dwarf.
I assumed that was you.
No, I can't vote as a presenter.
Yeah.
That's good.
Let's give it a moment longer for you to jump in.
So someone's in the chat saying no, it was me. But all it says is iPhone.
iPhone, yes. Thank you, iPhone.
Yes. Oh, isn't that a meta joke already?
Yeah.
The iPhone is responding to us.
Okay.
All right. Fair number of people going for HAL 9000 as well. That's unsettling.
Yes. All right. I might end this poll so we can get on with some more serious conversation. Here's the results. Oop, they're there. So as Luke was saying, a fair number going for HAL 9000, which is interesting. Holly, I think, feels pretty realistic to me. It feels some of the silly things as well as some of the serious things coming through. A little bit of a vote for Data. I know every so often I get a hint of the depressed Marvin coming through in some of the things I've seen. But hopefully it's an interesting space, and it feels that we really don't know where this is going at the moment, and that our sci-fi predictions for the future are really interesting and will hopefully help us think about this. Thanks, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So really quickly, at the start of this year, UQ responded fairly quickly for UQ. In early January, this position went past the University Senior Executive Team, recognizing that the advances in generative AI technologies present both opportunities and challenges for teaching and assessment. And I think the last line, I think, is what's really important for us, that we have challenges around academic integrity, but it's critical for us to help students to understand the ethical and effective use of generative AI. And this is an incredible challenge. As staff, it's hard to work out what the ethical and effective use of these tools are, particularly as it feels like they change on a weekly basis. Being in a position where we can help students do that is incredibly challenging, and something that I think is best done by working together. So the options that were provided that we could put forward for our assessment was, we could say that if a particular task prohibited the use of generative AI, this could be something like a quiz throughout where students are not invigilated and they could use it, but we ask them not to. There could be some in-person assessment where we watch students and know they're not using generative AI, or we could try and embrace the more complex and authentic assessment where students are able to use AI and hopefully do something interesting with it without lowering the validity of their assessment. Which brings us to this challenge of, well, how do we actually do that well? If we embrace that third option, how do we make our assessment AI resilient and ensure we're assessing what we really want to assess with our students in our assessment? Luke,
yep,
I think this is yours.
So we've been doing quite a bit of testing on how well it performs a variety of different tasks. And so it's like, I think it's useful to start off with a baseline of how well it can perform a task. So I've got this vet question. And so this is from an exam from 2018. It's in the UQ eSpace. And it says, discuss the mechanism of action of cholera toxin on water homeostasis in the intestines. Not sure exactly what that means, but let's see what it does. So I'm going to just pull up my share screen, if you don't mind. So I've got the question here in ChatGPT, and let's see what it does. I'm just copying it verbatim. Now, I don't have any biology knowledge or vet knowledge, but this is a really, really thorough response from what I can see. It explains what the cholera toxin is. It gets into the mechanism of the toxin by activating signal pathways, breaks it down into 7 different steps, all of which are well articulated, and a summary of it at the end, which tells us what's going on. Now, so is it accurate? I have no idea. But if it is accurate, this is a complete response to the question. The assessment task is just completed. And so that could represent a major, major problem to tasks such as which revolve around showing that you understand the topic really well. All right, so Dom, could we go back to the next slide?
I assume so. Depends on my capability to use Zoom.
So I've just copied it there. Now I regenerated the response a number of times, but it tended to come across this way. Now, in May, Jason Lodge at the School of Education created this sort of taxonomy of options of ways that we can go about dealing with this problem of the generative AI, pretty comprehensively solving a number of assessment tasks. And so we've got the ones which we really oughtn't to use, like ignore the problem or ban the problem, because they don't really work as solutions, and none of us are doing that, obviously. Invigilating is always a matter of using that task appropriately. Anything that requires a closed book exam is not going to be vulnerable to AI anyway, but doesn't work in every case. Embracing it is something that is going to take us some time to figure out. In the previous session, we talked a little bit about how, we need to build this capability, build it into our pedagogy. And might be 6 months, a year, a couple of years before we're at the perfect stage of that. Designing around, and rethinking, those are the things that we're going to discuss a little bit today. Designing around means finding out a way that the AI can't do it, and rethinking means figuring out a way that the AI will reveal itself, or perhaps some other way of incorporating critical thinking into the assessment task. So, onward. So, if we could pull up a poll too. So I've created these tasks, and I'd like you to get your opinion. Which do you think is the most AI resilient task? And so I'm using the term AI resilient rather than AI proof, because I don't think there's any such thing as AI proof. It's still going to be a problem. So which one is the least vulnerable, I should say? And so we've got the multimodal task, which requires that you go from one medium, so visual, to text to answer the question. You've got the context-sensitive task, where you have to be there in person or understand the context in order to answer it properly. Or you've got the critical thinking task, where you have to really delve down deep into a problem and unpack it fully. So have a go at the poll, guys. Which one do you think is the most AI resilient? So all of the images that we created today were using Bing AI most of the time, produces some interesting results. I didn't end up wanting all of my pictures to come out looking like Jordan Peterson, but here we are. It's what it seems to think a college professor is.
Right. I think in the poll there, we've got it.
So what have we got? So context sensitive task for the most people. Some people said critical thinking, multimodal one. Okay, yeah. There wasn't a correct answer to this question. We were mostly curious about where your thoughts were. But they all work in different ways because multimodal requires translating from one medium to another, which, well, actually, we'll get into that in a second because I've got a slide on that, I think. But yeah, they all can work. I'm not going to say that critical thinking is the only way to go about it here, but it's definitely the one that I want to spruik the most today. So, guys, what do you think? So I've got this sample response here. Now, this was in response to the third prompt there. Have a quick read of this. I want to ask, do you think that this was made by an 18-year-old who's just come out of an all-boys school and is responding in the most obnoxious way? Or is it an AI who is programmed to look like one? If you don't mind, could you tell me why in the chat you thought that was the case? Overwhelmingly, everyone thought it was AI. Asking rhetorical questions. So what's wrong with that? AI keeps apologizing to me. The writing is perfect and formal. This is kind of interesting because in my experience in teaching philosophy, students love rhetorical questions because they don't have to stand behind clear statements. Then it makes them sound smart without actually being smart. So it is definitely made by an AI, but rhetorical questions are still the bane of my existence. So the initial prompt took us it didn't take a lot to make it sound a little bit more human. Dom put through here, just make it more arrogant and reference to philosophers, which sort of bumped up the quality somewhat to make it a little bit more natural. So we could potentially see a fairly solid philosophy essay that's based on a student writing in the question and then adding a little bit of character flavor in there. So yeah, critical thinking questions aren't perfect in this particular way. So what are the benefits and challenges of each approach? So our first one, the multimodal. So if we just click, yep, there. So the multimodal is a designing around approach. So that was the fifth approach. And the benefit is that it requires significant digital literacies to engineer a prompt to describe it to an AI. If you want to go from a video to a text prompt, you're going to have to describe that in a lot of detail. And that's really, really challenging and it's time consuming. So you might need to translate from AI to AI to AI, and there's more errors introduced over time. So that's a good thing. But the challenge is that the question itself gives clues that you could give to a generative AI if you're a student, and that might give an adequate response. So you'd have to be really careful about the design. It's not going to work in every single context, and the AIs are improving. And so this solution, the multimodal thing, may not work in 6 months if we end up having a video plugin or an image plugin. It's just shifting sand here. Onto the second approach, we've got the context sensitive. And this is also the designing around. And a lot of you thought this was a good way to go. And I do agree, it can work really well, because if you needed to be in a specific place or time to understand what was going on, if you needed to know that someone was being sarcastic the whole time, then the AI will struggle to respond to it. You can create some really interesting novel assessment types by doing so. And you can improve engagement in class in a way by making students say, well, you need to be here, you need to see this particular lecture, or have this sort of personal engagement with it. The challenges, of course, it can be obtuse. It can be inequitable if a student misses it on the day or they have a language issue. It's always going to be difficult to create because you must be very cognizant of the situation. You need to replace it every single time you want to do it. And you could potentially add the context to the AI anyway, describing the situation, and still not do the task. So it may not work in itself. And once again, it may not work in 6 months as the AI gets better. So we've got the third challenge, the third approach, which is the adding critical thinking to your the assessment task. Upsides are that generative AI tends to perform poorly across a number of domains, and I'll explain that in detail in a little bit. The AI hallucinations and inaccuracies and nonsense are usually pretty easy to identify. So at the moment, we almost always catch them out. And the responses tend to be shallow and unoriginal when we're looking at someone who's just trying to avoid critical thinking. Challenges, of course, it's cognitively taxing to create. You need to do critical thinking to create critical thinking questions. And that's a significant cognitive load to put on to everyone all the time. By giving an AI an explicit cognitive task as well, they will perform better at that task. So it can be a little bit self-defeating, but not entirely. And AI does perform well at structuring responses, which is also a matter of coherence, which is a part of critical thinking. So it's all of them present positives and negatives. All right. So what I'd like to start us off with then on how we can go about sort of developing our assessment a little bit is through cognitive auditing. So this is something that the critical thinking project here at UQ has been doing for a number of years, but I think it's really useful to go through our tasks and determine what cognitive skills and verbs are being used, because this applies in every discipline everywhere. So I'd like to start off with a poll question. So this was the question again that we started off with on ChatGPT. Discuss the mechanism of action of cholera toxin on water homeostasis in the intestine. So what do you think is the cognitive skill that's being tested here? Is it interpretation, inference, evaluation, analysis, explanation, justification, or reflection?
in the poll.
Yep.
Share these results.
So most people went in for explanation, some in evaluation and analysis, a little bit of interpretation. And I think that's a really, really interesting alignment of voting, because I think that every single one of you is correct in this, in that proportion too. So this seems like a straightforwardly explanation-based task, but you also do need to do a certain amount of analysis and interpretation in order to answer the question properly, and a little bit of evaluation, because the verb here is discuss. The skill, you need to interpret what's going on in this sort of system. You need to be able to analyze the structure of, the intestines, and discussion always includes a certain amount of evaluative components. So there's all a little bit going in there at the same time, which makes it all the more important that we have this cognitive verb clear, and discuss may not be the right one. So I think some important questions to keep in mind whenever we're creating a question are what cognitive skills we want to assess, what cognitive verbs we are using. So the skill might not be the same verb in the sentence, and how are you measuring the thinking? And that's a tricky thing to do. Now, in making our critical thinkings, like every one of us does critical thinking to begin with. I'm not going to pretend that, it's a brand new thing and that we don't do it, because we do. We definitely do. But by making it more explicit, we can make it more resilient to AI. The way that we go about this is that critical thinking is always an applied skill. Sometimes I hear the argument that it'd be nice to do critical thinking, but there's just not time for it. But I think that's often a ridiculous thing to say, because it's always in the context of your content. So by taking that cognitive skill and applying content to it, we've got clarity of task, and we can clarify the task further by using the right verb. And these verbs and skills can be measured through values of inquiry. So I'm pulling from the work that Peter Ellerton did here at the Critical Thinking Project, who said that there are a number of domains that we can specifically look at student thinking in order to figure out what's going on in their heads to a certain degree. I'll get into that in a second. I think it's also worth mentioning for a moment that virtues of inquiry, so that's the dispositions that we have when we go about our thinking, are really important. We never ever measure them, because you can't measure someone's open-mindedness. But if you've developed if there's a classroom dynamic, a tutorial environment, which is, intellectually rigorous and honest, then that's going to be reflected in their performance of the task at the end of the year. So it's something to keep in mind. It's part of, programmatic approaches to assessment, where we're doing it holistically. Is really challenging over time, but we're all moving towards that in the end. All right, so next, please. So how do we measure our thinking using values of inquiry? By the way, I really love being AI image creator. You guys should have a play with it, because it's really fun to, say, how do you measure a brain? And it will do it for you. Anyway. So I'm borrowing again from the Critical Thinking Project here. This is not an exhaustive list of values of inquiry, but they're all useful and common ones that we share across nearly all the disciplines here. Accuracy, precision, depth, breadth, relevance, significance, coherence, cogence. So basically, truth, precision, how much detail, how many different perspectives, how related our ideas are, how important those ideas are, how logical our ideas are, and whether or not something's persuasive in the right way. And we can measure every single one of them, and they tend to be in rubrics already. But if we make them incredibly clear when we're developing those rubrics as well, we can start to measure that thinking.
Luke, which one's your favorite?
Personally, my significance is the one that I think is the most important. Now, in philosophy, we tend to prioritize coherence over everything else because, logic. But significance means that you need to know what information is the most important and why that information is important. One of the things that we often that I often encounter in philosophy in particular is some students being like, well, how's this going to help me get a job? And so my very first question is, why does that matter? Now, it's not just because I'm being snarky and I don't like the question, but that's definitely there. But the issue is that they haven't thought about why it's important to get a job and why university exists solely for money. Because at the core of it is this assumption that this is the way that they should be living, and it's completely unreflective. By looking at that, they end up going deeper into their own thoughts. And so this significance criterion, it's going to be really useful for us when we're trying to flummox an AI in a moment too, because the sneak peek on this one is that AI is terrible at knowing what's important and what's not. So when I first put together this presentation, I was going to pull from the Phil 1110 Introduction to Critical Thinking rubric, and it happened to be absolutely perfect in the way that I thought it would, because its rubric was set up to first measure the cognitive skills. So if you could have a quick click, Don, you could see there, we'll zoom this out in a moment so you can see it clearly, but it measures analysis and it measures evaluation. So we've got clear cognitive skills there. Now, in the next category, we've got the values of inquiry that it's measuring: significance, accuracy, and it says inferential connections, but that just means coherence. So could we go to the next slide? So you can see it a little bit clearly there. But yeah, Introduction to Critical Thinking really doesn't have any content in the same way as a normal subject does, because it's specifically building out these thinking skills. But it's interesting that the things that it values most are your analytical and evaluative skills, and your ability to know what's important, to be able to say it truthfully and to be able to verify information, and to say it logically. And this isn't going to be uniform across subjects. Every single subject, every single course is going to measure things differently and value things differently. And we're not going to necessarily want to spend all our time measuring 9 different values of inquiry, because that would just be exhausting. There's just not enough hours in the day. And despite the fact that we tend to use all of these values at the same time, we tend to only measure 2 or 3. And you might want to get into the specifics about style or substance that's just not captured by this particular task. Sometimes it's just going to be a matter of content, but you could still measure accuracy and precision with that. So one of the things that we've been doing is testing quite rigorously what generative AI is really good at and what it's not so good at. And some preliminary findings is that ChatGPT and ones like it perform well when it's given a clear and explicit cognitive verb. So that's working a little bit against us here. But when we measure that explicit cognitive verb against a value of inquiry, it tends to produce nonsense or underperform in a really noticeable way. So some examples that I've been finding is that whenever it evaluates something, it can't tell you what ideas are important or not. So, if we pick our value of inquiry carefully when we're measuring things, we'll often prevent students from from using AI the wrong way. When it's explaining things, it often doesn't go in enough depth on those sorts of things. So you really need to engineer a prompt where it explains things in detail, because otherwise it'll be shallow. And when it's justifying, it often lacks clarity. So this is not to say that the sentences don't make sense, but from a paragraph to paragraph perspective, it won't add up to a holistic, clear intention. It'll be an essay that just has a whole bunch of disparate paragraphs that internally make sense, but don't make a clear, coherent essay. So,
What wanted to do next was have a look at some of the ways students could use generative AI in their assessment. Again, we've been working through what's our goals of assessment. What do we really want students to be able to demonstrate evidence of being able to do, and looking at those values of inquiry and those different aspects of critical thinking that we say this is what's actually important here. So how do we give students frameworks and talk to students around, well, what should they do with generative AI to help them in the process of getting there? So I wanted to give a couple of examples, and I'm going to continue with this polling. If you get really sick of polling, we can move to chat. But it's hopefully a fun way to have a look at some examples and get your feedback around whether things are ethical or not. So when designing assessment, I did what I like to do, and I went to the Assessment Ideas Factory, and I grabbed something that I didn't know much about, and I used that as a basis to try and do something. And I found this idea of a brand strategy audit. I really don't know much about brand strategy audits. So if someone out there does and would like to correct things as we go, please feel free to do so. But I thought this was a really interesting example to play with, coming from that position of potentially a novice student who doesn't know what a brand strategy audit is. So I thought of a few prompts to help me progress my brand strategy audit assessment. So my first one was, again, I went to Bard for this, and it's what the interface looks like this. How do you undertake a brand strategy audit, and what makes a good brand strategy audit? So my quick poll, is this an ethical use of generative AI? If I was asked to do this assignment of creating a brand strategy audit, if I go to Bard, go to chat, or Bing, whichever one I like, and ask this sort of question, is that okay? Is that something that's ethical? Is my poll working? Oh, I can't see the poll anymore. Can anyone see the poll? Relaunch the poll. Does that work? Yay. All right, that's reassuring. Thank you. Anyone else going to take a position? Oh, sorry, my poll ended.
It's gone again.
It's gone again. All right, so let's do it the old-fashioned way. Can I get you to use the ticks and crosses reactions? And I'm gonna go back and minimize that. So if you think this is ethical, hit a tick in your reaction. If you don't, tick a cross.
All right, so we've got quite a few yeses.
Yes, awesome. So we've got most people saying, yes, this is an okay thing to do. Students are absolutely fine to go and ask for help around what's this assessment task actually asking you to do. All right, let's try another one. So I don't know how to. So if I choose to do a brand strategy audit on Twitter, I mean, I know Twitter's been going through some things at the moment. They might be looking at their brand and what strategies they're doing. And I was to go to one of these tools and ask, what sort of data is available around the brand of Twitter before I start doing my audit? Is this a reasonable thing to do? So can I get you to vote again? Yes, no, how are we going? Is everyone still comfortable with me going to a generative AI and asking it, give me some general information about a particular brand? Okay.
About 10 yeses and one no.
I've got a no. Yes. All right. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, did you want to say anything in chat or in real life or verbally around why this isn't okay? You're welcome not to, but okay, I'm going to move on.
It's just you know, they're not learning about how to acquire that information, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. And if the purpose of this assessment task was to get students to go out and find information, to explore where things come from, to look at, you know, Google search history results or what Twitter's done or what brands have done and know where that data comes from, then this would probably be a little bit more problematic. Okay, how about this one? So I want to know more about what does a good brand strategy audit look like. So I ask chat to identify leading marketing experts and develop an ideal outline for my brand strategy audit based on what these experts would produce if they all collaborated together. So now I'm getting the outline for my assignment. Who is saying this is okay, this isn't okay? It's just an outline. It's a template for a brand strategy audit. So in some ways, it's good. In other ways, I might be stepping on some lines here. I think less people are responding as it's getting tighter and harder.
So what do you think, everyone, is the difference between this one and the previous one?
Good question, Paul. Are we acknowledging AI? It's ethical, but it's not learning. Jennifer, thank you. Starting to make the response. So I think, oh, it's asking for people's names. Interesting.
It's interesting that, sorry, if Jennifer, that you said ethical but not learning. I mean, if we're at university and we're not learning, but we are still getting the task, what makes this ethical then?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I suppose from teaching ethics, I'm just taking it from a base moral versus ethical versus, yeah, when you cross the line to where you might be breaching codes of ethics.
So this is like the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Correct. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's perfect. I love it.
Yeah.
And again, I'm putting these questions out there in part because, it's what we're challenged with. It's what our students are faced with. And if we tell the students to do ethical or do the right thing, and we're struggling with it.
It wouldn't be okay if it was part of the assessment task for marks. Yeah. So the nature of it matters too.
Yeah. And how often is the outline or the structure of a document what students see is being for marks? So again, it's not, I haven't shown it in the cut, but all this did was give an outline of here's the areas that you would put into a brand strategy audit. Yeah.
Yeah, I really like the idea that it's like, how will you know the ideal if you never explore all the options? So it's limiting itself to one perspective to begin with without thinking about it. So yeah, that's a
and
really
would this
good
be
point.
A more ethical prompt if I put, rather than develop an ideal, develop 4 very different brand outlines, and then I'm going to pick my favorite?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's try another one. This one's hopefully simpler. Let's be blatant and just say, write a brand strategy audit for Twitter. And again, these things will give it to you. They will write a brand strategy audit. It could be a terrible brand strategy audit. It could be a great brand strategy audit.
Now, Chris, you make a good point. We're assuming that this is the only way that students develop the outline. And I mean, like, I want to be a believer in them and their essential goodness, but experience has taught me that extreme distrust is always warranted.
I'm on the other side. I'm all up for students trying these things, and maybe they look at it, and maybe they look at their own version and they go, actually, here's some differences. I like my bit better here, and I like the generative AI bit better there, and they combine the best of both of them. And maybe they put an acknowledgement statement down the bottom of their assignment saying, I asked for some help, this is what help I did, and here's how I used it.
Now, Ben had a good question there. Is it different to Google these questions than to ask an AI? I would say that it is quite different because Google will provide you with someone else's answer. And then it will just be straight up plagiarism if you're not citing it. Whereas the AI generating it for you does all the thinking, does a process, and may not, it might be a completely novel way to look at it, which makes it harder to detect. Googling is simply throwing available information at you. But it's a really good point.
Yeah. Okay. All right, and Tim, happy to do anything you can get away with, as long as you can get the right product.
If you don't mind me taking the response on that, Don. Tim, so I agree with you in one way, but then I run up against the problem of a student who is really good at prompt engineering and is simply filling out Mad Libs on their screen. And so that's something that becomes entirely procedural, which means that they might be skipping over the task. It's possible that they're doing that too, but it's also possible that they've just become really, really good at not thinking about it. And this was going to get more difficult as the technology improves as well. So it's problematic.
And it goes back, I think there's two questions in my mind. There's the product versus process thing, which I'm going to get into in a minute. And then there is the point of, what are you actually asking students to do? Like, is the purpose of developing a brand strategy audit to be able to go, here's a brand strategy audit that I could submit to, a boss, and maybe they're happy and they loved it. I got it out fast for generative AI, and they are absolutely thrilled and love the speed and what's produced. Maybe it's some deeper knowledge around some of the aspects along the way. And I think it's very contextual. Do you want to add anything, Tim, while you're...
Yeah, I think in industry like this particular, like if you're going to limit it to this context, I like that you've asked these questions and broaden the context. But in this context, I think in industry, the first thing someone preparing a brand audit is going to do now is this. And it's to give them a concision, really. It's about, keeping things as short as possible. So I think, yeah, in a general context, like when you're trying to measure the things that you've been talking about previously, it is problematic. But for this context, I don't see a problem with it as like a foundational level, like to try and gather the knowledge as quickly as possible for the foundational skill.
Yeah. And a little bit of preliminary research that's been done around, how does generative AI add the most value in industry is, making these first drafting bits and the development part faster and giving people more time to polish and improve the quality of their work at the end, and checking the facts are right, checking the presentations are right, improving the quality there. Which is important. Okay.
And Tanya's asked a really good question there as well. And this keeps coming up. What are the students being marked on? Research skills or knowledge of brand strategy? And so we'll end up coming back to the cognitive audit again, but I think this is a persistent problem. What is it that they're supposed to be learning?
All right. And I think this is my last one, where I've drafted my brand strategy audit. I've done all my work as myself, and then I put it into one of these things and say, can you maybe find some leading researchers in the area and based on what their work is, review what I've done and give me some hints about how to improve this work. And again, I think this one's really tricky because if I gave it to a peer and asked them to review it and said, can you improve the text or what doesn't make sense? But if I give it to ChatGPT or to someone else and ask this type of question, again, it's going beyond the, can you identify typos and issues with my expression to actually, is the content good? Or your mum, yes. My mum has looked at previous work for me and said, this bit does not make sense and you need a comma there. Okay. So the main message I want to get out of this is that this space is really messy. It's really tricky. I've tried to follow roughly this series of ideas across the side. So our student services team have guidance for students in how to construct assignments and assessment, and it follows along these 6 steps. So I was trying to pull out different parts of this and say, how could I use generative AI to help me with each of these different steps along the process of developing my assessment? And it may be that some of these steps you're absolutely happy with students using generative AI. Some of these steps could be really critical to what you're trying to assess. And maybe parts of this process is what you want to look at, and then in solution, you may not be that worried about at all. But all of that is contextual. All of that matters in the specific context your students are working with, the type of assessment you're doing. And the only way I think that we can keep moving in this space is talking to students, because those differences between the context and where we're at. All right, there's my points. Luke, back to you.
All right, so I want to run you through a method for developing AI resilience in assessment, one that can work in all contexts. It's going to be imperfect because we are on shifting sands. So, but I think it's worthwhile doing because it also helps clarify the assessment as well. So let's pull out the. So the first is to write your assessment question with those explicit cognitive skills and verbs. One of the most famous questions that was ever in like the philosophy curriculum in high schools was free will, discuss. That was it. That was the whole question, right? Now, that didn't have a clear cognitive skill or a cognitive verb, and it wasn't clear in its task, but it definitely was really, really interesting, producing a lot of different results. Still, I think that we can move past this for something that's a little bit more equitable. So, yep. Number 2, select the values of inquiry that are important to this task and from the learning objectives. So, from whatever the course is, it'll say it's trying to develop these skills. Not all of them will matter. Like I said, for something like philosophy, significance and coherence are really important. But for other subjects, if it's, say, marketing, cogency, the ability to be persuasive in context might matter more. If it's something like medicine, precision, getting the details right might be really, really important. Number 3. So then we apply those inquiry values to skills. And I'll show that in a moment too. 4. Test that question against a generative AI to see how well it can perform against the original question. It might produce nonsense and might immediately solve it, but either way, that's something that you should be able to test pretty quickly. Number 5. Now, most AI have a regenerate button, which will just redo the prompt a second time. I think it's worthwhile doing 2 or 3 times. It'll only take a few seconds, but sometimes it produces wildly different results depending on the question. Now, if it's producing wildly different results, the question's probably okay. If it's being very, very consistently good, then there might be a problem. So number 6, create a more sophisticated prompt. So this takes a little bit more time and effort, and it is frustrating, but you can get it to behave in a certain way that it will be far more elaborate and start to look at whether or not students who have significant digital literacies might cause a problem for this or not. But yeah, I mean, that would be maybe a paragraph. I know that at the top end of prompt engineers, they might be writing 500 or 600 word prompts. But I don't think that would be necessary. I think more like a paragraph outlining some roles might be enough. And I'll show this in a moment too. And finally, I think it's really important as well to take a moment to look at the criteria and how they're weighted, because sometimes there might be a significant amount of weight placed on the overall structure of, say, an essay task. But because AI does that so perfectly now, it might be worth saying, hey, maybe that should be worth 10% instead of 50% now. I think that's just generally good advice across every single subject to really be precise about what it is that we're assessing and what's important to the subject. But it can also minimize the harm caused by a generative AI doing the task. Sorry, Chris, I only just noticed your response there. Would no be a valid response to free will discuss? I think you'd fail because you're not discussing it. So, like I said, you're not going to want to go through every single value of inquiry here because that would just take forever. But for this, I'm looking at the skill of inference and I'm looking at the value of accuracy. So the 2 criteria points are the conclusions true and correct, and how well do the conclusions represent the intended meaning? So I've mocked up a sample little rubric for that at the bottom using ChatGPT, actually. And I got it to simply outline it into a 7-to-1 formula. And it provided me with every single detail that I needed. And now we're really being clear about what different types of thinking we're assessing. So I wanted to show you, I want to show you how this can be done, because I don't think it's too onerous. And I don't think it's also fair to be like, you're on your own creating these prompts. This can be made a lot easier with a standard template. So I created this prompt: act as a philosophy course coordinator, writing a rubric for an end-of-year philosophy essay on Kantian ethics. Create a rubric in a table. It will have 4 rows, 8 columns. The criteria will be measured, will be the accuracy of analysis, depth of evaluation, and coherence of argumentation, all about Kantian ethics. So I've got 3 cognitive skills and 3 values of inquiry there. The scale will be from 7 to 1, with high distinction, credit, pass, conceded, fail, and incomplete. Write a 1-sentence description in each cell. So I want to show you how this works if we do it. So I've just copied and pasted there, and it's actually really useful in this way. So see what it does. Okay, rubric done. Okay, my time doing marking in this subject is over. It's all complete, and it's pretty solid. Demonstrates exceptional depth in evaluating the strengths and weaknesses. You know, that's a usable rubric. I don't think it's quite right yet, though. So, can we go back to the other to the slide, Dom?
Yep.
But yeah, that's not too bad. Now, if we want to get fancier about it, we can change it a little bit. So I've created a changed prompt here where I don't want to just be analyzing Kantian ethics. I want to be looking at the categorical imperative, which is the big concept for Immanuel Kant. And we also want to look at evaluating his critics. So I've highlighted those in red. Now, I also want to align to the PPLs of UQ. So I've changed it so the descriptions include exceptional, advanced, proficient, functional, developing, minimal, and absent in that descending order. And because I want to be a real smarty pants, provide a number of marks as a number for each row as a heading in each range. Now, that last bit may not be a good idea, depending on the subject, but it can be if you need to get into a particular apportionment of marks, if you needed to know that it's like 31 to 34. But yeah, so that will produce an even better form of the rubric for you, and reduces the cognitive load on the person having to do this, so they don't have to spend all their time doing complicated rubrics. All right, so that's the end of the content that we have for you here. I wanted to mention to you a couple of things though here at the end, is that the assessment, there is assessment design support from the digital assessment team at Italy. And this is one of the things that we can help with, because we have been doing quite a lot of work in redesigning for Inspira to update and adapt and enhance courses so that they can best use the technology. But we can also review the assessment and do health checks for AI resilience and look at the question sets generally. So that's a service that Italy provides, that the digital assessment team provides. Secondly, is that we've got an upcoming assessment design community that is being established, where we're looking to look at our collective expertise together and showcase diverse assessment initiatives and resources, and generally help each other out and make a meaningful impact on this. And so joining that gives you access to the Assessment Inquiry Network, which I'll explain in a second, assessment designs, inspiration, learning events, postcards from Assessment Island, which is just a quick way of looking at your assessment and getting a little bit of anonymized help, and presentations and publications. We've also launched the Assessment Inquiry Network, which is a community of, it's part of this community, but it's going to be a number of events over the semester and going forward, which looks at contemporary practice on a number of topics in assessment land. The first event is going to be about programmatic approaches, and I'm going to be the presenter at this first event, but it's going to be based on a community of inquiry. So this is an approach where we all get to sort of read a paper or listen to things about the paper and just evaluate it from a number of different angles. And get into arguments and debates and just like have time to sort of be collegial about it and share our knowledge as learning designers and educators and course coordinators on these sorts of things, and have a little less of a serious space to look at these sorts of things. So hopefully you guys love it to see you there. It'll be a good time to do these things. There'll be once every couple of months, but yeah, please do come.
I'm looking forward to getting there myself. Couple of quick other updates. The resources and feedback, resources from this session, as well as across the whole of Ready to Teach Week, will be mailed out to everyone who's registered. So if you're looking for them, they'll be with you soon. If you have immediate needs for them, reach out to Luke or I, and we'll be happy to give you them in advance. The other one that's running is there is a scavenger hunt running across the campus. So if you are on campus for the next couple of days and would like to join in that, Stuart, Jonathan, and Gemma are running this, and they're going to have lunch where you can bring your own lunch and have a chat on Thursday, but beforehand, engage in the scavenger hunt. It looks amazing. We have 4 minutes before our next session in Ready to Teach starts, which will be about understanding student behavior in your course. Incredible work with Course Insights. I encourage you to take a 3-minute break and be back with us. I have a quick feedback on the session poll, which I'm just going to launch now. Thank you everyone who has contributed. It's been a really fun discussion. I've really enjoyed your contributions and engagement and willingness to play with the different things that we are doing throughout. If you have further ideas around how we can do this better, Luke and I are very happy to chat at any time around ways we can use generative AI or support people to do things with assessment in this area, help improve communication in the way we support students. So thank you all so much for your contributions today and for being a part of this.
And thank you so much for those kind words in the comments. And Tim, I might cry. That's just beautiful. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
See you later.